Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump from one point in the video to another, there are chapter titles down in the video timeline, and if you click on those, it'll take you to one point of the video to another. In this week's Casual Friday, I have a couple of tidbits, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the episode talking about how to reverse engineer a sweater. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the sweater that I have here. So let's get started. So I have three tidbits today. The first one is, in case you hadn't heard, that Cat Bordhi, who is a well-known knitwear designer, writer of books, as well as teacher, has died. And she knew she was dying. She had announced it a few months ago. And it's really too bad. She was a very creative thinker and came up with some really unusual ways of designing things and of teaching people how to do those things. In particular, some of the books that she wrote that I happen to have are New Pathways for Sock Knitters. So she came up with some interesting ways of knitting socks in different ways that were really interesting. I happened to take a class from her at the time when this book came out. So it was it was an all-day class, and it was really amazing. Another book of hers that I have is A Second Treasury of Magical Knitting, which has her really ingenious method of casting on to do Mobius knitting, which is really amazing. She's written many, many books, and she taught for years. So it's really too bad, but I thought I'd let you know in case you hadn't heard it. Clara Parks, who runs the website Knitters Review, wrote a really wonderful tribute to her, which I will leave down in the video description. So last week, when I gave you a tour of how my office is set up with yarn storage and yarn organization, I took a little brief detour and showed you this wall hanging I have that I use to store my circular needles. And someone mentioned in the comments that, oh, I should patent that and mass market it or something. The thing is, I didn't invent this method of storage. There actually is a commercially available version of this storage solution called Circular Solutions. I'm going to leave a link down below. The reason that I didn't use this commercially available one, there's a couple of reasons. One is that they only have sizes, US sizes, I think 0 to 15 or maybe 1 to 15, I'm not even sure. And I have a lot more sizes than that. I have metric sizes that are not, don't have an exact US equivalent. Like I have 2.5 millimeter needles, which is a US 1.5. So I didn't want to store those with the US 1s or the US 2s. I wanted to keep them separate. And the second thing is that the pockets in the Circular Solutions are about an inch or so deep. So they have room to hold tons of circular needles. And some knitters have tons of circular needles. They have multiples of each size, and they have all different lengths. And I don't. I am really a needle minimalist. I use a 32-inch circular needle for just about everything, and I just change the technique I use depending on what is required of the project. So if I'm doing something in a small circumference, I'll use magic loop. If I'm doing something that's kind of medium circumference but smaller than a 32-inch circular needs, I'll use traveling loop. If I'm knitting flat, I'll do that. So I really just adjust what my technique based on what is required. So I didn't need pockets that were that deep. And I also needed more pockets. So that was why I created my own version of that solution. But it could be a solution that would work for you. So that's why I'm leaving a link down below. Now, some people are going to hate having their circular needles hanging on the wall like that. Some people have these notebooks of zipper pockets, and they keep them all in there, and they have the original packaging for their needles. And that is just like, I would never do that. They would come out of the notebook and they would never go back in. So my system of organization is it just stays on my desk until my desk is too cluttered, and then I need a way to quickly put everything away. And so I just look at the number, the needle number, and I stick it in there, and it's within reach of my desk. I don't have to pull out a zipper thing and flip through it. So everybody has different organizational needs, and they have different types of different quantities of needles. They just have different needs. And so that's the solution that I had for myself. But the commercially available one may be something that does work for you. Got a couple of comments about my yarn storage solution, which is basically to have my stash yarn, the new yarn that I've never used, and so I'm very likely to forget it if I can't see it, that I have these open cubes on a shelf so that I can always see my yarn, and that what I have stored in bins is leftovers by yarn weight, so all of my worsted weight leftovers. So I don't really need to remember what kind of leftovers I have. I just need to be aware that I have them, and if I'm needing some for swatching purposes or because I'm needing a specific color in a small amount, I can just look through that bin very easily. I used to keep my worsted weight leftovers up on that wall with all my new yarn because I use worsted weight yarn so often. But the problem is that these are these tiny little balls, and so many of them will fit in the same storage unit on the wall, and they would just fall out. So that was something like the visual solution definitely is something I need for new stash yarn, but the leftovers were more suited to be in a bin. Now, I had a couple of people ask me about, don't you worry about moths? And what do you do to prevent your open yarn being attacked by moths? And the answer is, I don't do anything. I've never had a problem with moths. I've lived in the Midwest my entire life. I'm 58 years old, never had a problem with moths. That doesn't mean I never will have one, but it's not a problem I'm trying to solve. I was trying to solve the problem of needing to be able to see my yarn and have it always visible so that I will be constantly reminded of what I have and I will know that. So that was the problem I'm trying to solve. In the future, sometime, maybe I will have an issue with moths, and at that point I may decide, well, I need to solve both the problem of being able to see my yarn and to prevent moths from attacking it, or I may decide that, geez, this is the first time in almost 60 years I've ever had a problem with moths. What are the chances I'm going to have this problem again? And then continue on. I don't know, but I don't worry about moths, and so this is how I have it stored. One of the reasons it's never been an issue, I've never been concerned about it, is because every yarn shop I've ever gone to in the past 30 some years that I've been a knitter has their yarn on open shelf displays so that the customers can see that. So maybe yarn shops do something to prevent moth infestation, but typically moths want dirty wool, not clean wool. So they're more likely to go after things in your closet or in your storage, particularly if you've got some food or sweat on it. And it's not the moths that are eating your clothes, they lay the eggs in there, and it's the larvae, the caterpillars, that eat the protein in the wool. So if you are concerned about moths because you've had a problem or you're worried that you're going to have a problem, then I would encourage you to do some research to figure it out. But I have never had a problem and I don't worry about it. So I want to talk about reverse engineering. I want to talk about what it is and sort of what are the different flavors of reverse engineering or replicating an existing item, what those various versions are. And then I'm going to talk to you about how I'm approaching that process for this particular sweater. So reverse engineering is taking something that exists already and then sort of taking it apart and figuring out how it was created so that you can duplicate that. So one way of reverse engineering something is to actually duplicate the thing exactly. You might see a sweater that you really like, or you might have a sweater that you really like, and you want to duplicate that thing exactly. That's one way of doing it. So you'd be using the same yarn. You might be using a different color. You might be using wool instead of acrylic or cashmere or something. But essentially, you want to recreate that exact thing. Then there is a situation that a lot of people who sew are in where maybe they have a favorite blouse or a pair of pants or a skirt or a dress or something, and they really like the way it fits, and they want to use that garment as a pattern in order to create other copies of it. And they will use different fabrics. They're not trying to actually recreate that exact same thing. They're trying to recreate something that has that same silhouette and that same fit. So that's another example. In knitting, what it might mean is that you are figuring out what the exact dimensions are, and maybe you just want to recreate that silhouette but have different stitch patterns. Like you have a stockinette sweater that you really like and you want to make that thing again, but you want to put a different stitch pattern in it. Then there is the idea of sort of replicating the idea of a particular garment. And I think this happens a lot when a knitter volunteers to make, say, a sweater for a relative, a child or a spouse or a friend or somebody, and they're talking about what kinds of sweater that they might want to have. The sweater recipient will see a picture online, or they'll see somebody in the street who's wearing a really cool sweater and they'll, can I take a picture of that? And they take a picture of it. Or they see something in a magazine, or they see something that they really like, and they send that picture to the knitter and they say, this is the sweater that I want. Can you make that for me? And the knitter, depending on their skill level, may be kind of overwhelmed thinking about replicating something, because maybe, oh, I've done cables before, but I've never done cables that are that complicated, or I don't really understand how this thing is put together. And they're trying to replicate what they see exactly from a photograph. But it turns out that what the recipient wants is an oversized green sweater, and maybe they like, it has cables in it, but they didn't even notice that. They just noticed that it's sort of bumpy and has texture to it. They don't really know. So that's when you have to have a conversation with that recipient and say, what is it that you like about this particular sweater? Like, what is it that you want to have? And what it might be is they want something oversized with the drop shoulders, or they want something that's cropped and loose, or they might want something with a cowl neck. You have to kind of pinpoint what it is that they want, because often then you can take an existing pattern and then just give them the color they want, or add a cable, or make a different stitch pattern. You can modify something that exists already. You don't have to recreate something exactly from scratch. So these are the different types of ways that you could reverse engineer or replicate something. So the reverse engineering I have done in the past has been true reverse engineering, but it has been done from photographs. I didn't have the actual item that I could measure and look and count stitches. The first time was a sweater that I wanted to knit. I had decided I wanted some kind of bulky knit turtleneck sweater, and I got an email that said, oh, we're discontinuing this particular bulky yarn. It's on sale. And so I bought a sweater's quantity worth of it, and I was looking for a pattern. I wanted something reasonably simple. I wanted cables and I wanted it reasonably simple. And so I was looking through Ravelry for pattern ideas for inspiration, and I came across a pattern that was really interesting to me, because it didn't just have simple cables. It had simple cables that were moving diagonally across the fabric. And I thought, that's really interesting. And so I looked at the source of the pattern. Where could I get that pattern from? Well, it had been published in a German knitting magazine called Rebecca 5 years previously. So this was 2009, and it was published in 2004, before Ravelry even existed. It wasn't possible to get a new copy of it. So in order to get the pattern, I would have to get a used copy. Well, again, this is a German knitting magazine. As luck would have it, that particular issue was the very first issue where they were also publishing an English version of it. So I'm like, yay. I looked online to see if I could find used copies of it anywhere, and the only copies I could find, it would have cost me $20 to get the 5-year-old magazine in order to have the one pattern. And I thought, that is so expensive. I emailed the company, the magazine, and do you have this pattern available in some other way, or would it be cheaper? Do they have back issues of it? Maybe it would be cheaper to buy it directly from them and have it mailed. But I never got a response from them, and I really didn't want to spend $22 on a single pattern. Well, there were, I don't know, five people maybe who had made this sweater and had posted their project photos on Ravelry. One of them had made it in worsted weight, so they had modified the pattern and knit it in a different yarn gauge, and with a different yarn weight at a different gauge. But there was somebody who had used the bulky weight yarn that was called for and had taken really clear photographs, and they had knit it in the size that I wanted. And so I looked at those photographs and I counted stitches. I figured out how many stitches I was going to need. And then I had to figure out that stitch pattern. And that was actually really fun for me because it was something unusual, and I kind of, and I wanted to do that. So I counted stitches, I counted rows, I counted cable crossings, and I figured out how to make this sweater. I was nervous about the armhole shaping. I wasn't sure that I was going to get that figured out, but it worked out really well. And I knit the sweater and I was really happy with it. My kids who were in high school did not want me knitting for them for the most part. There was a particular hat at Urban Outfitters that they really liked, but it was either sold out or was in colors that they didn't like or something like that. And they wanted, it was a cabled hat. And again, I was able to look at the photos. I could count stitches. I figured out what yarn weight was being used. And I was able to figure out that hat and knit one for each of them. And then finally, there was when my oldest daughter graduated from high school, she saw a sweater again at Urban Outfitters, but she didn't like the colors that it came in. And she wanted it in red because the college she was going to, the school colors I think were red and white. And so sometimes they had events where everybody was supposed to be wearing a red shirt, and she thought, well, that would be something that she could wear that was red at these events. And so she wanted me to knit this sweater in red. And that was another one where I had to be able to look at the pictures up close. I figured out from the stitch counts and the measurements what the yarn weight was, and then I figured it out that way. So those things were all truly reverse engineered, and they were reverse engineered from photos and by figuring out the yarn weight and the stitch counts and the sizes and then being able to match those exactly. So this is a sweater that I talked about last week, and I found it in one of the bins that was stored here in my office. It was in a bin I never went in. I didn't store yarn in it, so it was never in there. And I found it, and it's a sweater that I've had for years. I loved it. I wore it all the time. I wore it so much that I wore through the left elbow. And I was not interested in trying to fix this. I wouldn't have had the yarn because it wasn't hand knit to begin with. Any fix for it would either be covering it up or using a different yarn, and it would basically be a patch. And I wasn't interested in that. I can do it. I've done it before. I've done it when I have knit socks for somebody, and I used a merino wool with no nylon, and they wore the socks all the time, and they got holes in them, and they asked me, can you please fix these? I absolutely would fix them for that person. Socks for myself, not a chance. I have a lot of socks. I enjoy knitting socks, but those were a very special gift for that friend, and I understood why she wanted to have them fixed, and I was willing to do that. But it isn't a task that I enjoy doing. I don't like it at all. So what would be more interesting to me would be to reverse engineer the sweater, because I liked the size of it. I liked the pockets. I liked the length. I liked the V-neck. I liked everything about it. So that was something that I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to recreate. And as I was reorganizing my yarn, at the same time, I realized that I had yarn that I had purchased the year before, and also a skein of yarn that I had hand dyed myself that I wanted to use in a sweater that had simple cables. And then I would use the red hand-dyed yarn as an intarsia cable occasionally. And I thought, oh, I've got a perfect matchup of two sweaters that I've been wanting to knit and haven't gotten around to, and I'll pair them together, and I will remake this sweater, and I will do it in some way so that I have red cable occasionally here and there. And so what I needed to do was to take measurements of this, count stitches, take measurements, and figure out how this was constructed so that I could knit it again using the yarn I have. So in this case, this type of recreation is not really a total reverse engineering, because I am not using the same yarn weight that this sweater was knit in. If I was going to just reverse engineer this, I would have found that, oh, this is an Aran weight yarn. I'm going to get an Aran weight yarn, and then I can replicate this exactly. The yarn that I already have is a worsted weight yarn, which is a little bit thinner. So this is worked at 4 stitches per inch in stockinette. and my worsted weight is in 5 stitches per inch in stockinette. So I have to figure out how am I going to recreate this silhouette. So I want this exact shape again. I'm not going to apply a different stitch pattern to it. I'm going to use the same stitch pattern, but I may need to adjust how these cables are knit in order for them to be the same size. So that's something I have to think about. So this is really a hybrid of reverse engineering. I have to figure out how this was originally knit, and then I have to figure out how am I going to knit it again, but using a different yarn weight. So it's a little bit different. I mean, I'm lucky that I have the actual sweater in my possession, but it's somewhat more complicated process because I'm using a yarn weight that's different. So what I'm going to do now is show you sort of an overview of the process that I use for examining this sweater and figuring out all of the different components of it, so that I can then sit down and sort of redesign it using the yarn that I actually have. So the first step of reverse engineering something like this, or trying to replicate something like this, is to look at how it's constructed. You don't have to construct it exactly the way it was constructed originally, but it's helpful to understand how it was originally constructed and what the components were, because that'll help guide you when you're doing measurements. So what I see in this is a cardigan, a V-neck cardigan with pockets, and it has a set-in sleeve construction. So this isn't a raglan, this isn't a yoke, it's not a drop shoulder. These have sleeves where it comes pretty straight down from the shoulder, and then it curves around the body on the underarm to allow for the width of the body. So that's happening on the body itself, and then the sleeve has what's called a sleeve cap. So it is kind of curved, kind of a bell-shaped curve that also wraps around the top of the arm. And so this is the most tailored sort of sleeve, and it's the one that I prefer in my sweaters. So it's certainly what I want to replicate in this sweater. The other thing to know about this is that this sweater was knit in pieces from the bottom up and then seamed. So you can see the seams inside here. So one of the things that I realized was more helpful for taking measurements was to measure the sweater from the inside rather than measuring it from the outside, so that I could let the seams lie flat, and then I could measure directly from seam to seam. So I'm measuring a couple of different things. One of the things that I'm measuring is the stockinette gauge of this sweater. That tells me what yarn weight the sweater was originally knit in. And what I'm finding is, and I have like these little strips of fabric right here that on the right side of the fabric, these are the reverse stockinette columns between the two cables. So on the wrong side of the fabric, they appear as stockinette. And I can measure the gauge. Well, these are only 4 stitches, and it turns out that they're about an inch wide. This isn't a way to totally confirm that that's what the gauge is. So I have some wider areas at the side seams that I can also measure to confirm. So I was pretty sure that I was getting 4 stitches per inch in the stockinette. Then the next thing I did was to measure the width of these cables. And I measured them in a couple of different places. The problem with measuring knitted fabric is that it stretches. And so if you've laid it down and it's a little wider this way, or if you've laid it and it's a little stretched this way, you can get measurements that don't always agree. So I measured these cables many times and decided that they were usually somewhere between 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 inches wide. And I looked at the number of stitches that were in there. There's 12 stitches in there. What, this gauge of 4 stitches per inch, that would mean that it was 3 inches wide if it were just in stockinette, but with the cable crossings, that pulls the cables in a little bit so that they end up getting pulled in about a 1/2 inch just because of the cable crossings. So when I'm measuring cables, I'm measuring the actual width of the cable. When I'm measuring stockinette, I'm measuring that in terms of stitches per inch. So I count all of the stitches that I have in each piece, and then I add up those components and see if those are adding up to what I actually measured in the total physical width. So there's a little bit of, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, and measuring and remeasuring and seeing how you can get agreement in the end. So the next thing to do is to really look at the stitch patterns that are being used in this garment, because in addition to the reverse stockinette or stockinette and the cables, there are different stitch patterns that are used for the borders. So what I see on the tops of the pockets is a knit 2 purl 2 ribbing, and that is the same as the ribbing that I see at the bottom edge. But the button bands are worked in a different stitch pattern that looks a little bit like knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, but this is actually brioche, and it's upside down over here because the button bands were knit in one long strip that started at this edge, goes up and around the neck and back down here. So I was looking at this and counting the stitches in there. I determined that this was a single brioche, otherwise known as fisherman's rib. So there are a couple of different ways of working this. So I looked at that, and then I looked at how the buttonholes were created. So what I'm seeing is that these buttonholes were created in the ditch between these brioche columns here. Because this is a commercially knit thing, what they used was machine knitting or machine sewing around the buttonhole, and then they cut it. So that is something I'm going to have to figure out. How do I create, this is a vertical buttonhole that's about 3/4 of an inch long. How would I create a buttonhole in this kind of fabric? I'm going to have to do it a little bit differently in hand knitting, so that's something that I have to consider and think about. I'm also looking at the cast on and bind off edges, and seeing that they used tubular cast on, tubular bind off at both ends. I'm seeing that this brioche, which is stretchy, is not stretchy at the base, and I realized that these stitches were all placed on basically on the yarn tail. So they were finished off just by threading them onto the yarn tail and then anchoring them so that this edge wouldn't stretch, it would remain stable. For the cable pattern, I needed to figure out how this cable was done. This is a 12-stitch cable, but it was not crossed by taking 6 of the stitches and crossing them over the other 6. It is a flatter cable than that. And what I can see is that it is basically a traveling cable. So this is 3 stitches over here are traveling across the other 9 stitches, and it happened over the course of 3 right side rows. So the first right side row, 6 stitches were worked and then crossed 3 over 3. The next right side row, 3 stitches were worked and then 3 over 3, and then on the last row just 3 over 3. So there were 3 right side rows that were involved in the cable crossing, and then 2 wrong side rows in between. That was 5 rows total, and then there's 11 rows of just plain stockinette. So it's a 16-row repeat altogether and 12 stitches wide. So now I know how the cable was worked, and I know that this is brioche, and I know how the cast on and bind offs are worked. And I look at the pockets, and what I see is the pocket doesn't actually span the entire width of these 2 cables. It stops right here. So there are a few stitches over here on the edge that just maintain in stockinette and come up above the pocket top where the cable is then crossed again there. So that was something I never noticed on all the years that I wore it, and it kind of bugs me a little bit, but on the other hand, I never noticed it. This pocket is 5 inches wide. I don't think I'd want it another 1/2 inch wide. I think it's fine the way it is, but it's something that I'm going to keep in mind about whether I want to do anything different about this pocket. Perhaps just even move it over a little bit so that it might be symmetrical on both sides. One of the things I was interested in is to see how the decreases were worked for these underarm, for the sleeve cap and for the body. So I took a very close-up look at them because some of the decreases can be seen on the right side of the work here. And what I could see is that they were using a decrease that's commonly done in commercial knitwear for underarm bind-offs. And that is that if you look here where my thumbs are, there's 4 stitches in between my 2 thumbs. and those get decreased down to 2 stitches. And what they do, I've done a video on this, which I'll link to at the top. What they do is you have 4 stitches and you cross these 2 over and you work these 2 together as a knit 2 together and these 2 as a knit 2 together. So these are kind of decorative, but they also allow you to decrease 2 stitches at a time. So that's something that they were doing in order to eliminate the particular cable as part of the sleeve cap. And I looked on the inside of the fabric and I could see that they were doing something similar in the body as well, that there were these 2 over 2 cable double decreases, and then they switched to single decreases and they were spacing them out a little further. So that's something that I look at because I can look at the number of stitches that were decreased over the number of rows in the gauge of this sweater and kind of see how much actual fabric was eliminated in width and also over how much measurement in length, and kind of see how that gets calculated. So I figured out that this was an Aran weight cashmere yarn, and I also looked at it closely, and it was a chainette construction yarn. It wasn't a typical plied yarn, it was chainette, which isn't really going to make much of a difference in the sweater I've chosen. But what is going to make a difference is the fact that I'm not using an Aran weight yarn, I'm using a worsted weight yarn. So I'm going to need more stitches for my sweater than what was used here. And so that means I have to make some decisions about how I'm going to convert this sweater to a worsted weight sweater that has more stitches than what this has. But the first thing I needed to do was to confirm that I understood how this cable was done. So I did a swatch using the same number of stitches across over the same number of rows, and I got my first swatch, and I realized, of course, that it was narrower because I'm not using the same gauge. So then I have to make a decision. I can't replicate this exactly using these stitch counts because I don't have yarn that will allow me to do that. I have a thinner yarn. So what I have to figure out is, do I want to knit these cables the same number of stitches over the same number of rows and have them be narrower than they were in the original sweater, which means I have to have more stockinette in between. So do I want to do that, or do I want to keep these cables as close to the size as they originally were, which would mean that they have to be worked over more stitches and more rows. This is an Aran weight yarn, 4 stitches per inch. I'm using worsted weight yarn at 5 stitches per inch. That makes it easy to replace the 4 stitches, which is 1 inch of stitches in between these cables, with 5 stitches. I have 8 or 10 stitches over here, so I can make those I can make 8 stitches into 10 worsted weight stitches, that sort of thing. But what am I going to do about these cables? So what I realized was that the 12 stitches that these had, if they were just stockinette, would have been 3 inches. So in my yarn, that would be 15 stitches. And I realized that what I could do was, instead of crossing this cable 3 times, doing a 3 over 3 cable 3 times, that I could do 3 over 3 cable 4 times. And I could keep the number of rows, straight rows, at 11 and just take 4 rows, 4 right side rows to do the crossings, and that would give me 2 additional rows in length, and that might be close enough. So I did the original cable with 12 stitches wide and 16 rows. So I started playing with different row counts and to see which one I liked better. So this one right here, I worked the 11 rows straight, and then I did the 4 crossings. So this is 18 rows instead of 16. And then for this one, I thought, well, maybe I just want to keep 16 rows all together, but have the crossings take longer. And that made something a little flatter this way. So I think that, and this is, stretched out here. So I think what I'm going to do is use this version, the one where I have 2 additional rows in length and 3 in width, and that will give me something that's closer. And you notice that this is sort of more relief than this. This is a pretty flat cable, and I think that has to do with maybe the chainette construction, maybe because it's cashmere, or maybe because this sweater is like 20 years old and it's been sitting in a drawer for a long time and just has flattened out. I really don't know, but I do know that mine is going to be more relief. I did some other swatching with this isn't the yarn I'm actually going to be using in my sweater, but I wanted to kind of see how the red cable would look with, on a gray background. Again, my red is a hand painted, a little different. The two tones are different for the yarns I'm going to be using. I just wanted to experiment. And one of the things that I've decided is that I think what I want to do when I have a red cable is to cross that in the opposite direction, so that it's red and it's crossing in the opposite direction. That is just something that I think I would really like to do. I also did some swatching in brioche as well as swatching in ribbing to see what it would take to get a ribbing that was this fine a gauge, because this is much finer than you would normally have if you were doing hand knitting. Usually you go down a couple of needle sizes, and this is finer than that. And what they've done with this ribbing was they made it a finer gauge and more stitches so that it would just hang straight, but it would be at a really fine gauge. And so then when they transitioned to the main body, which is knit at a looser gauge, they ended up having to decrease out stitches at this transition in order to bring it down to the stitch count needed for the body. So that's something I'm contemplating. And do I want to do that too? Do I care about replicating that? Or do I want to do something that would be more like what a hand knitter would do? One other thing that I am thinking about is where I want to place my red cable. So I think that what I'm going to do on one sleeve is place the red cable up the center. And again, this will be going in the opposite direction, I think. And then on the back, I will do one of the cables. So if I do a cable on this sleeve, then I would do a cable somewhere on the back, one of these two. Probably, oh, not the center. I haven't decided if I want to go all the way to the left, or I kind of want to go right here, not all the way over to the left, but maybe between the center and the far left, so just sort of to the left. I want to do a red cable there. And then the other places that I'm thinking about doing red would be like the pocket tops, or potentially, because the pockets inside are all stockinette, potentially just doing the pockets in red. That would never really be seen, but just it might be something fun, and it might be a way to use up the red yarn if I'm not using it up in the cables. That might be something to think about. So I could do the back and the sleeves first and see how much of the red yarn I have left, and see how I want to use it. One other thing that I'm thinking about is with these buttonholes, how I can do those. And it could be that I do something like just a regular vertical buttonhole, and I might use crochet around the edge in red, or use buttonhole stitch in red or something. I just haven't decided what I'm going to do. And I don't know about buttons either. Maybe I'll find some cool red buttons, or maybe that'll be just too much. I don't know. So those are all things that I am thinking about. So the final step in the calculations is looking at how the sweater is laid out and adding up all of the individual measurements of each of those units. So I have cables that are each 2.5 inches wide, but I have reverse stockinette stitches, which I calculate how much room they take up based on the actual stitch gauge. So I'm going to add all of those up and see if they add up to the same width that I got when I actually physically measured the back. And that will tell me if I have those gauges correct, and I'm going to end up with the thing that's as wide as I want. And if I got all that correct, then I can convert those numbers using my worsted weight gauges. So in the original, there were 32 stitches in reverse stockinette in those columns, either between the cables or at the side seams. So I had 32 stitches. I was calculating there was a gauge of 4 stitches per inch, which would mean that that was 8 inches total that was in reverse stockinette. Each of the cables was 2.5 inches wide, and they were 12 stitches each. So I have 60 stitches making up those cables. And because they're 2.5 inches wide a piece, that is a total of 12.5 inches just from the cables. So I can add up all of the stitches. I have 32 reverse stockinette, 60 in the cables, plus I have 2 selvage stitches. So the total is 94 stitches, including the selvage stitches. So when I calculate how wide that is total, I have 8 inches of reverse stockinette and 12.5 inches of cables. That gives me something that's 20.5 inches wide. And that is about what I measured. I was looking at it, and it looked like it was between 20 and 20.5 inches wide. So that tells me that that was correct. So I can now convert that to the gauge in the yarn that I am using. So since this was 8 inches wide, that's what I'm going to need with my worsted weight yarn, which I'm working at 5 stitches per inch. So that's 40 stitches of reverse stockinette. And for the back, it's really easy because these were just a full inch. So I just replaced the 4 stitches with 5 stitches here, the 8 stitches with 10 stitches here. And the 5 cables, I still want them to be 2.5 inches wide. And the way that I do that was to create a 15 stitch cable instead. So now I have 40 stitches in reverse stockinette, 75 for the cables. That's 115 stitches plus the 2 selvage stitches. And it should, if I've done all of my swatching correctly, it should still end up being 20.5 inches wide. So it's really common with a cardigan for each of the fronts to be exactly half of the back. And then you have the button band, which is usually 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide. So the front ends up being an inch to 1.5 inches wider in total than the back because of the band. But in this case, things got adjusted a little bit so that the fronts are slightly smaller because the band is wider. So in this case, there were 10 stitches at the edge. I put 5 here, but it's really 4. 4 in the middle, and then 6 at the edge. And these 6 right here are actually 5 purl stitches and 1 knit stitch, so that there is a column of knits that's running up the front right next to the brioche button band. And so that makes a nice transition for that. So there's 6 here, 10 there, 4 there. That's 20 stitches altogether in reverse stockinette. And then there are the 2 cables. So I have 20 stitches of reverse stockinette. That's 5 inches in the original, which means I have to distribute them as 25 stitches in my version. The 2 cables that were 12 stitches each add up to 5 inches. I'm going to have 15 stitch cables instead, and they will again add up to 5 inches. So the original was 20 stitches of reverse stockinette plus 24 cable stitches, which was 44 stitches, plus the 2 selvages. Instead, I'm going to have 25 stitches in reverse stockinette, 30 stitches making up the cables, which is 55 stitches, plus the 2 selvages. And that adds up to a 10-inch front. So the 2 fronts together are 10 inches each. And then I have a 2-inch band, and there'll be a 2-inch band on each side, but it's going to be overlapped. So that's going to give me a front that is 22 inches across. So that's 1.5 inches wider than the back. So that is absolutely very typical in the total measurements for the sweater. So one of the things that I realized yesterday when I was looking at the dimensions of like how deep the armholes were and how big the sleeves were, I started thinking to myself, geez, I wouldn't design something with those dimensions if I was doing it from scratch. I'm just going to try this on because I hadn't tried it on for years. I don't know how many years it's been in this bin, but it was in there a long time. So I tried the sweater on. And what I realized was that the sleeves are really quite large around the upper arm and the armholes are very deep, and it's just more fabric than I care for. So in addition to having to deal with the yarn gauge, I'm actually going to make some changes with the armhole sleeve, the armhole depth, and the sleeve caps. And there's some other things that I have to consider as well. So as a commercially knit item, these cables are crossing, and then at the point where the decreases to create the V-neck occur, the stockinette portion gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's really common in commercial knitwear. And depending on where my cables hit and where the last crossing is, that may be something that I do, or I may do something that's slightly modified where I continue the crossing even if there are fewer stitches. I don't know. It's something I'm going to experiment with. So the sleeve right here starts out narrower and gets bigger, and as it gets bigger, finally, eventually, there are enough stitches to make this one crossing, and then the decreases occur for the sleeve cap. So this is something that I have to think about. Do I want to do this? Have all of this stockinette here and only one crossing? That's something that I'm thinking about. There are some tweaks and changes that I may make from a design standpoint that I can make because I'm designing this specifically for me and what I want and for my size. Somebody asked me in the comments if when you reverse engineer this, are you going to publish a pattern? And the answer is probably not, because I am figuring out the things that I need specifically for my size. I'm not thinking at all about, well, how would this work out if it was 2 sizes smaller, 2 sizes larger than this, or even 4 sizes larger. I'm not trying to solve that problem. I'm trying to solve this very specific problem. So what's interesting to me is figuring all of this out and planning it and doing the knitting. What's not interesting to me is to figure out how to do this in 12 different other sizes so that other people can knit it. So that is just not, that's just like after all of the fun is done, that would be a lot of work. And it's something that a lot of knit designers enjoy doing, but it's not something that I would particularly care to do myself. So I will keep you updated on my progress on this. I am continuing to work on my 1890 sweater. I am just working on it very slowly. I did get the neck grafted back together, and I will talk about that next week and show you what I ended up doing. The problem that I was having, if you watched last week's episode, where I had tried grafting twice. I got started with the grafting twice, and both times it was wrong. People were sending me links to, oh, well, this is a great way, and this is another great way. The problem was not the method that I was using. The problem was I was using the wrong set of instructions. It turned out I had seen these instructions a couple of years ago, so I knew how the article was laid out, and I just jumped down to the part of the article where that had the section that I needed for my instructions, and I was just looking at the wrong set. So that was the problem. Once I was looking at the correct set of instructions and I saw what to do, I didn't have any problem. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, particularly about the process of reverse engineering or recreating a beloved sweater, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.